There are moments in history that slip through the cracks, not because they lack meaning, but because they lack spectacle. They happen in quiet rooms late at night, when the air is heavy and the lamps flicker low. They happen when ordinary people, doing their best to stay present, falter under the simple weight of being human. This is one of those moments. A story about weariness and grace, about a young man who fell, and about the God who met him there, not with judgment, but with compassion. Tonight, we're travelling back nearly 2,000 years to a city by the sea, to an upper room filled with believers, to a window where exhaustion finally won, and to a fall that should have ended in tragedy, but instead became a testimony to the kind of mercy that doesn't make headlines. This is the story of Eutychus, the young man who fell asleep while Paul was speaking. Chapter 1. The upper room at Troas was not the kind of city people remembered for grand monuments or legendary battles. It was a port city on the western coast of what we now call Turkey, positioned along the Aegean Sea where trade routes converged and travellers passed through on their way to somewhere else. It was practical, functional, a place where people worked, lived, and quietly practiced their faith without much notice from the world around them. The city had a history, of course. Ancient Troy, the Troy of Homer's epics, had stood not far from this location, though by the 1st century that legendary city was long gone, reduced to ruins and memories. The Troas of Paul's time was a Roman colony, established by Augustus himself, and it served as an important stopover for ships travelling between Asia Minor and Macedonia. Merchants passed through regularly, soldiers stationed there for brief tours of duty, sailors restocking their vessels before heading back out to sea. It was the kind of place where you could disappear if you needed to, where you could blend into the crowds of travellers, and no one would ask too many questions about who you were or what you believed. And in the 1st century, for followers of a crucified Jewish teacher named Jesus, that anonymity was sometimes necessary. Being a Christian in a city like Troas meant gathering in private spaces, homes, upper rooms, places where you could speak freely without drawing the wrong kind of attention. The faith was still new, still spreading, still misunderstood by the broader Roman world. To many Romans, Christians were simply another strange sect, perhaps harmless, perhaps not. They refused to participate in the imperial cult, refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor, and spoke of a kingdom that wasn't Rome. That made them suspicious, potentially dangerous. So believers met where they could, away from the public squares, away from the temples, away from the eyes of those who might see their gatherings as subversive or threatening. They met in homes, usually in the largest room available, which was typically on the upper floor where there was more space and more privacy. On this particular night, the believers in Troas had gathered for something special. It was the first day of the week, what they now called the Lord's Day, a time set aside for worship, teaching, and the breaking of bread. This was not the Jewish Sabbath, which fell on the 7th day. This was something new, a day chosen because it was the day Jesus had risen from the dead, the day everything had changed. But this was not just any meeting. Paul the Apostle was there, and everyone knew he would be leaving in the morning. Paul was not someone you could take for granted. His visits were rare and precious. He travelled constantly, crossing mountains and seas, enduring shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonments, all to bring the message of Jesus to cities that had never heard it before. He had planted churches throughout the region, in Philippi, in Thessalonica, in Corinth, in Ephesus. He had debated with philosophers in Athens. He had reasoned with Jews in synagogues across Asia Minor. He had stood before governors and kings, never backing down from what he believed, never softening the message to make it more palatable. When Paul came to your city, you didn't waste the opportunity. You listened, you asked questions, you stayed as long as he was willing to speak. And Paul, for his part, was always willing to speak. The meeting took place in an upper room, a large space on the 3rd floor of a house, accessible by an exterior staircase common to buildings of that era. The architecture of Roman-era buildings in port cities like Troas typically featured these external stairs, which allowed residents and visitors to access upper floors without going through the ground-level spaces that were often used for storage, workshops, or housing for animals. Upper rooms were often used for gatherings because they offered more privacy and space than the ground floor. They were removed from the noise and traffic of the street. They provided a place where people could sit, talk and worship without constant interruption. And in a culture where hospitality was sacred, offering your upper room for a gathering of believers was a significant act of generosity. The room was packed that night. People sat along the walls, their backs pressed against the cool plaster. Others stood in corners, shifting their weight from foot to foot as the hours passed. Some crowded near the doorway, craning their necks to see Paul, straining to hear every word. Everyone wanted to be close. Everyone wanted to hear. The demographics of the room would have been diverse. There would have been Jews who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, Gentiles who had turned away from the worship of Greek and Roman gods, merchants who had heard the gospel in other cities and brought it back to Troas, slaves who had found in Christianity a message of dignity and hope, and women who in this new faith were treated as full participants, not as property or second-class citizens. Lamps burned throughout the room, not electric lights or even candles as we think of them today, but small oil lamps, clay vessels filled with olive oil, each one producing a flickering flame that cast long dancing shadows across the walls. The lamps were simple in design. A small bowl to hold the oil, a spout where a wick, usually made of twisted flax or papyrus, would protrude and burn. There were many lamps that night, enough to light the entire space, enough to push back the darkness that pressed against the windows, enough to fill the air with warmth. But warmth, in a crowded room, becomes something else. With dozens of people packed into a space designed for perhaps half that number, with oil lamps consuming oxygen and producing heat, with the windows providing only minimal ventilation, the air grew thick, heavy. The kind of atmosphere that presses against your chest and makes your eyelids feel weighted. The kind of warmth that, combined with the late hour, makes staying alert a physical effort. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. The sea breeze that typically swept through Troas during the day had died down. The streets were empty. Most people were asleep in their homes, resting before another day of work. But inside this upper room, on the third floor of an unremarkable building in an unremarkable corner of the city, something remarkable was happening. The Apostle Paul, the man who had encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, who had been blinded by the vision and transformed by the experience, who had spent years in Arabia processing what it all meant, who had argued with Peter about the inclusion of Gentiles, who had survived stoning and shipwreck and imprisonment, was speaking. And everyone in that room understood that this might be their last chance to hear him. No one seemed to mind the heat. No one complained about the crowding. This was not a place people wanted to leave. This was not a sermon you checked out of early. Paul was speaking, and that was enough. The atmosphere in the room was one of intense focus. People listened not just with their ears, but with their entire beings. They were hungry for teaching, desperate for encouragement, aware that the world they lived in was hostile to what they believed, and that they needed every bit of spiritual strength they could get. Someone had opened the windows to let in whatever breeze might be available. The windows, simple openings in the wall, some with wooden shutters that could be closed during bad weather but were left open now, provided the only relief from the stifling atmosphere. And it was near one of these windows that a young man named Eutychus had chosen to sit. Chapter 2. Paul's Long Farewell. Paul stood near the centre of the room, his voice steady and strong despite the late hour. He was not a young man anymore. The years of travel had weathered him. His body bore the scars of his work, marks from beatings, remnants of illness, the toll of sleepless nights and constant movement. He had described himself in his letters as weak in bodily presence, and there may have been truth to that. He was not an imposing figure, not the kind of man who commanded attention through physical presence alone. But when he spoke, none of that seemed to matter. His words carried weight, authority. Not the kind that demanded submission through force or intimidation, but the kind that invited people in. The kind that said, "I have seen something true, and I want you to see it too." Paul spoke about Jesus. This was always the centre of his message. Not a philosophy, not a set of rules, not a system of self-improvement, but a person. a Jewish man who had lived in Palestine, who had taught and healed and challenged the religious establishment, who had been crucified by Roman authorities, and who, impossibly, inexplicably, had risen from the dead 3 days later. The resurrection was the hinge on which everything turned. If Jesus had stayed dead, then he was just another failed Messiah, another would-be revolutionary whose movement died with him. But if he had risen, if death itself had been defeated, then everything changed. Then hope was possible. Then the power structures of the world were not ultimate. Then Caesar, for all his legions and all his claims to divinity, was not the final word on how the universe worked. Paul spoke about grace. This was his particular emphasis, the theme that ran through all his teaching. Grace meant that you didn't have to earn God's love. You couldn't earn it. It was given freely, not because you were good enough or righteous enough, or had followed enough rules, but simply because God had chosen to love you. This was a radical message. The entire ancient world operated on a system of patronage and obligation. You did things for the gods, and the gods, if you had performed the right rituals, made the right sacrifices, would do things for you. But Paul said that God's love didn't work that way. It wasn't transactional. It was freely given to people who didn't deserve it, couldn't earn it, and could never pay it back. All you had to do was receive it, trust it, let it transform you from the inside out. He spoke about the resurrection and the hope it brought to a world that desperately needed hope. In a culture where life was often brutal and short, where infant mortality was staggering, where plagues could wipe out entire cities, where war and violence were constants, the promise of resurrection was more than comforting. It was revolutionary. It meant that death was not the end, that the people you loved who had died were not simply gone, that the injustices of this world would not stand forever, that God was making all things new. Paul spoke about how the gospel was not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles too, for everyone who would believe. This had been the great controversy of Paul's ministry. Many Jewish Christians believed that Gentiles who wanted to follow Jesus should first become Jews, should be circumcised, follow the Jewish dietary laws, observe the Sabbath and the festivals. Paul had fought against this idea with everything in him. He insisted that faith in Jesus was enough, that Gentiles didn't need to become Jews first, that the death and resurrection of Jesus had torn down the wall between Jew and Gentile, making one new humanity. This teaching had cost Paul dearly. He had been opposed by other Christian leaders. He had been rejected by the Jewish communities in city after city. He had been beaten, imprisoned, and left for dead. But he had never backed down, because he believed with absolute certainty that this was what God had revealed to him, that the gospel was for everyone, that no one was excluded, that the love of God had broken every barrier. He spoke about the challenges ahead. Paul was a realist. He didn't sugarcoat the difficulties that believers would face. He knew that persecution was coming. He knew that false teachers would arise, claiming to speak for God, but twisting the message to suit their own purposes. He knew that some people would fall away, that churches would split, that the work of building Christian communities would be hard and messy and often heartbreaking. But he also knew that they were not alone, that the Spirit of God was with them, that they were part of something larger than themselves, that the kingdom of God was breaking into the world, quietly but inevitably, and that nothing, not persecution, not death, not the powers of Rome, could ultimately stop it. And then he kept speaking. Hours passed. The night deepened. People shifted in their seats, stretched their legs, whispered quiet prayers. But no one left. No one interrupted. This was not boredom. This was devotion. Paul was leaving in the morning, and no one knew when or if he would return. So they stayed, and Paul, knowing this, gave them everything he had. It was not unusual for Paul to speak at length. In other cities, he had debated with philosophers in public squares, spending entire days in dialogue with anyone who wanted to challenge his ideas. He had reasoned with religious leaders in synagogues, going through the Hebrew scriptures verse by verse to show how Jesus fulfilled the ancient prophecies. He had taught new believers late into the night, answering their questions, addressing their doubts, helping them understand what it meant to follow Jesus in a world that didn't understand. Paul's mind was sharp, his memory vast, his passion unrelenting. He had been educated by Gamaliel, one of the most respected Jewish teachers of the time. He knew the Torah, he knew the prophets, he knew the writings. He could quote scripture from memory, could weave together passages from different books to make his case, could anticipate objections and answer them before they were even raised. When Paul spoke, he didn't just deliver a sermon. He poured himself out. He gave everything he had to give, holding nothing back, because he understood that time was short. Not just the time he had in any given city, but the time he had left in his life. He knew that enemies were waiting for him in Jerusalem. He knew that arrest and imprisonment were likely. He suspected, though he didn't say it explicitly, that he might not survive much longer. So he spoke as if every word mattered, because to him it did. But even the most devoted listener has limits, and as the night stretched toward midnight, those limits began to show. Chapter 3. Eutychus at the window. Among the crowd that night was a young man named Eutychus. His name, in Greek, meant fortunate or lucky, a name that would take on a strange and unexpected meaning before the night was through. We know very little about Eutychus. The biblical account gives us his name and his age. He's described as a young man, which in that culture typically meant someone in their late teens or early 20s. We don't know if he was born in Troas or had come there from somewhere else. We don't know if he was Jewish or Gentile. We don't know what he did for a living, whether he was a merchant or a labourer or a craftsman. What we do know is that he was there, present, engaged. He had made the choice to attend the gathering that night, which was not a trivial decision. Depending on his circumstances, being publicly associated with the Christians could have been risky. It could have affected his business relationships. It could have made him suspect in the eyes of the Roman authorities. It could have separated him from his family if they didn't share his faith. But Eutychus had come anyway. He was there because he wanted to be there, because he believed in what Paul was teaching, because he was part of this new community of believers who had found in Jesus something worth risking everything for. Eutychus was not a leader in the church. His name doesn't appear in any of the letters Paul wrote to other communities. He wasn't mentioned as an elder or a deacon or someone with a particular spiritual gift. He was simply there, a believer, a participant, someone who cared enough to show up, to listen, to be part of what was happening in that upper room. But Eutychus had made a choice that many others had not. He had positioned himself near the window. The windows in ancient buildings were not like the sealed, insulated windows we know today. They were openings in the wall, sometimes shuttered with wood, sometimes covered with cloth or oiled parchment to let in light while keeping out some of the weather, sometimes left completely open. In a climate like that of Troas, with its mild Mediterranean weather, windows were often left open most of the year to provide ventilation and light. On a night like this, with the room so crowded and the lamps burning hot, the window was the only place where you could feel a breeze, the only place where the air didn't feel suffocating, the only place where you could take a full breath without feeling like you were inhaling heat. So Eutychus sat in the window, not standing outside on a balcony, there was no balcony, not leaning out dangerously, at least not at first. He was perched in the opening, half inside the room and half outside, his legs likely dangling over the edge or propped against the sill. It was a practical choice, a comfortable one, the kind of decision that makes perfect sense in the moment. From his position at the window, Eutychus could see everything happening in the room. He could see Paul standing near the centre, his hands gesturing as he made a point, his face intense with concentration. He could see the faces of the other believers, lit by the flickering lamps, their expressions rapt with attention. He could hear every word Paul spoke, could follow the thread of the argument, could absorb the teaching. But he could also feel the breeze on his face, cool, refreshing. A welcome contrast to the heat of the room, and therein lay the danger. Eutychus listened as Paul spoke. He absorbed the teaching, the encouragement, the warnings. His spirit was willing, his heart was engaged. He understood that this was important, that Paul was giving them something precious. that these words were worth remembering, worth holding on to, worth living by. But his body, like all human bodies, had its own needs. And as the hours passed, those needs began to assert themselves. The night grew late. How late exactly, we don't know. The text says Paul spoke until midnight, but that doesn't tell us when the meeting started. It could have been going on for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, long enough that the initial energy of the gathering had worn off, long enough that people's backs were starting to ache from sitting, long enough that the novelty of Paul's presence had given way to the simple, physical reality of being human and tired. The air, even by the window, felt heavy, not oppressively so, the breeze helped, but there was a quality to the late-night air, a thickness, that made it feel like the world itself was slowing down. The rhythm of Paul's voice, steady, consistent, thoughtful, began to blend with the warmth of the room and the exhaustion of the day. Eutychus had probably been up since dawn. That's what life was like in the ancient world. You rose with the sun because that's when you could see to work. You worked through the day, hard physical labour most likely because that's what most people did. And when evening came, you ate a simple meal and prepared for bed because lamp oil was expensive and you couldn't afford to waste it. But tonight was different. Tonight Paul was there. So instead of going to bed, Eutychus had come to the meeting. He had climbed the stairs to the upper room. He had found a spot by the window where he could hear and breathe, and he had settled in for what he knew would be a long night. He blinked, shifted his weight, tried to focus on what Paul was saying, something about the Spirit, something about love, something about the body of Christ and how all the different members had different roles but were part of the same whole. It was important. Eutychus knew it was important, but his eyelids felt heavy, like someone had attached tiny weights to them. Every time he blinked, it took more effort to open them again. His head felt thick, his thoughts sluggish. The words Paul was saying still made sense when they reached his ears, but they seemed to be reaching his ears from farther away now, through some kind of filter, as if he were hearing them from underwater. Eutychus adjusted his position in the window, sat up straighter, tried to look more alert, but the effort it took to maintain that posture, to keep his eyes open, to stay present in the moment, was immense, and growing by the minute. He didn't want to fall asleep. That much is clear. He had chosen to be there. He had positioned himself where he could hear. He had stayed when others might have left. His presence in that room was not an accident. It was a choice, an expression of his faith, a statement that what Paul had to say mattered more than sleep, more than comfort, more than the very reasonable desire to be lying in bed at this hour. But weariness does not ask permission. It does not wait for a convenient moment. It does not care about your intentions or your devotion or your desire to stay engaged. It simply arrives, quiet and inevitable, and takes what it needs. Chapter 4. Sleep takes hold. Eutychus fought it. He opened his eyes wider, forcing them to stay focused on Paul's face. He adjusted his posture again, trying to find a position that would keep him alert. He focused on the words Paul was saying, trying to anchor himself to the meaning, to the importance of the moment. But the weight of sleep is a physical thing. It's not just a feeling, it's a force. It presses down on the eyelids like an actual weight. It slows the breath, deepens it, makes it harder to take the quick, shallow breaths of alertness. It dulls the senses one by one. First the ability to focus on visual details, then the ability to track complex arguments, then the ability to distinguish individual voices from the general murmur of sound. And in a warm room, late at night, with the rhythm of a familiar voice in the background, even the strongest will can falter. The human body has rhythms that operate independently of our conscious choices. Circadian rhythms, the release of melatonin, the drop in core body temperature that happens in the late evening, the slowing of metabolism. All of these things work together to prepare the body for sleep, and they are not easily overridden by willpower alone. Eutychus's body was telling him, in every way it knew how, that it was time to sleep. His brain was releasing chemicals designed to shut down conscious thought and begin the processes of rest and repair. His muscles were relaxing, letting go of the tension that keeps us upright and alert during the day. His mind was beginning to drift, to wander, to lose its grip on linear thought and slip into the associative, dreamlike patterns of pre-sleep consciousness. His head drooped, just a little at first, then a bit more. His chin moved toward his chest, and his eyes, those heavy, weighted eyes, finally closed. For a moment, Eutychus was simply sitting in the window with his eyes closed, still conscious in a way, still aware on some level of where he was and what was happening, but that level of awareness was thin, fragile, like a soap bubble that could pop at any moment. His body relaxed, the tension in his shoulders released. The muscles in his neck, which had been working so hard to keep his head upright, finally gave up the effort. His breathing deepened, became more regular. The sounds around him, Paul's voice, the quiet rustle of other people shifting position, the distant sound of night birds outside, all of it began to blend together into a kind of ambient hum that was no longer distinguishable as separate sounds. And then, so gradually that he probably didn't even realize it was happening, Eutychus slipped into sleep. It happened at the boundary between conscious and unconscious. One moment he was listening, trying so hard to stay present. The next, he was gone. Not gone in the sense of leaving, but gone in the sense of no longer being present. His mind drifted, his awareness dissolved, and his body, no longer under the governance of conscious thought, began to respond only to the physical laws of balance and gravity. His balance shifted, just slightly at first. His weight, which had been distributed evenly on the windowsill, began to tip forward, toward the outside, toward the empty air 3 stories above the street. The window was not designed to hold someone who had lost consciousness. There was no railing, no barrier, no safety feature to catch him. Ancient buildings didn't have building codes or safety regulations. Windows were simply openings in walls, and if you chose to sit in one, you were responsible for maintaining your own balance. Eutychus's weight continued to shift, forward, outward. His body, responding to the pull of gravity, began to move through the opening. There was no sudden moment of realization, no last-second attempt to catch himself. He was asleep. His conscious mind was offline. His body was simply falling, responding to the most basic physical law in the universe. One moment Eutychus was sitting in the window. The next he was tumbling through the air, 3 stories. In a building of that era, each story would have been perhaps 10 to 12 feet high. 3 stories then meant a fall of 30 to 35 feet. More than enough height to be fatal, more than enough time during the fall for the body to rotate, to accelerate, to build momentum. It happened fast, faster than anyone could react, faster than anyone could shout a warning, faster than Paul could stop a mid-sentence, faster than the people sitting near the window could reach out to grab him. One moment there was a young man sitting in the window, listening to the apostle speak. The next moment there was just an empty space where he had been, and the sound, that terrible final sound, of his body hitting the ground below. The impact shattered the stillness of the night like a stone dropped into glass. It was a sound that didn't belong in the peaceful evening, a sound that violated the sanctity of what had been, up until that moment, a sacred gathering. A sound that turned teaching into crisis, meditation into panic, peace into chaos. Inside the room, everything stopped. Chapter 5. The silence that follows. For a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, though it felt like much longer, no one moved. The human mind struggles to process sudden tragedy. It takes time for the brain to catch up to what the eyes have seen, to what the ears have heard. There's a delay, a kind of buffer, where the mind tries to make sense of what just happened, tries to fit it into some framework that makes it understandable. Did he just fall? Did that really happen? Did I actually see what I think I saw? Paul stopped speaking mid-sentence. His mouth was still open, shaped around a word he would never finish. His hands, which had been gesturing to emphasize a point, froze in midair. His eyes moved to the window, to the empty space where Eutychus had been sitting just moments before. The people sitting near the window stared at the opening with expressions of shock and disbelief. Some of them had been sitting close enough to touch Eutychus, close enough that they could have reached out and grabbed him if they had realised what was happening, but it had all happened so fast. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. And then someone screamed. It was a woman's voice, high and sharp with terror. The sound cut through the paralysis that had gripped the room, breaking the spell of shock and setting everything into motion. The meeting dissolved instantly. People rushed toward the stairs, stumbling over each other in the darkness, their voices rising in panic and disbelief. The orderly gathering, the quiet, reverent atmosphere of teaching and worship vanished as if it had never existed. Now there was only chaos, fear, the desperate need to get downstairs to see what had happened, to help if help was possible. People crowded the narrow staircase, pushing and jostling in their haste. Someone dropped a lamp and oil spilled across the floor, creating a slick spot that sent one person sliding into another. But no one stopped. No one slowed down. The urgency of the moment overrode everything else. They poured out into the street below. The night air, which had seemed so peaceful just moments before, now felt cold and harsh against their faces. The sky was dark, no moon, or perhaps just a sliver of moon providing barely any light. The stars overhead were bright, the way stars only are when there's no artificial light to compete with them. But the beauty of the night sky was lost on the people streaming out of the building. Their attention was focused on one spot, on the place where Eutychus had fallen, on the crumpled form lying motionless on the ground. A small crowd gathered quickly, forming a circle around him. Some people knelt, others stood frozen, unable to look, unable to turn away. A few held lamps they'd grabbed on their way down the stairs, and the flickering light cast strange, dancing shadows across the scene. Eutychus lay on his back. His arms were splayed out to either side. His legs were bent at awkward angles. His head was turned slightly to one side, his eyes closed, his face pale in the lamplight. There was no obvious blood, no visible wounds, but that didn't mean anything. Internal injuries from a fall like that could be catastrophic. Broken bones, ruptured organs, bleeding inside the skull that would never be visible from the outside. Someone knelt beside him and placed a hand on his chest, feeling for the rise and fall of breath. Another person touched his neck, searching for a pulse, that faint rhythmic throb that would indicate life. A third person leaned close to his face, holding a hand near his nose and mouth, to see if they could feel any exhaled air. Nothing. The man checking for a pulse looked up at the others, his face stricken. He shook his head slowly. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but its meaning was clear. There was no pulse, no heartbeat, no breath. The words spread quickly through the crowd, spoken in whispers at first, then louder, more certain. He's dead. The young man is dead. Eutychus is gone. The Greek text is unambiguous about this. It doesn't say he appeared to be dead or seemed lifeless. It says he was taken up dead. The people who examined him, people who would have had plenty of experience with death in a time when it was a much more visible part of everyday life, were certain. This was not unconsciousness. This was not a coma. This was death. Grief moved through the gathering like a wave. Some people wept openly, tears streaming down their faces. Others stood in stunned silence, their minds unable to fully process what had happened. This was not supposed to happen. Not here. Not during a meeting about hope and resurrection and the power of God. Not while Paul, who had raised the dead before, was still upstairs speaking. Someone should tell Paul. Someone should go get him. But no one moved. They all stood there, clustered around Eutychus's body, paralysed by the enormity of what had just occurred. The atmosphere was heavy with a particular kind of grief, the grief that comes from senseless tragedy. If Eutychus had been sick, if he'd been old, if there had been some warning or some way to prepare, it might have been easier. But this, a young man, falling asleep and tumbling from a window during a worship service. It felt wrong, arbitrary, cruel. Some people probably felt guilty. If only I had been sitting closer. If only I had noticed he was falling asleep. If only I had reached out to wake him. The if-onlys of sudden death are among the most painful thoughts a human mind can produce. Others might have felt angry, at Eutychus for being careless, at themselves for not preventing it, at God for allowing it to happen. When tragedy strikes during a religious gathering, when death intrudes on worship, it raises questions that are hard to answer. Where was God? Why didn't he prevent this? What kind of God allows a young man to die while listening to his apostle speak? And then, as if summoned by the weight of that question, Paul appeared. Chapter 6. Paul goes down. Paul did not run down the stairs. He did not shout. He descended calmly, deliberately, his face unreadable in the flickering light of the torches and lamps people had brought outside. His sandaled feet moved steadily on the stone steps, each step measured, unhurried. If he was panicked or frightened, he didn't show it. The crowd parted as he approached, stepping back to give him space, watching to see what he would do. All eyes were on him now, not just watching, but expecting, hoping. Because if anyone could do something about this, it would be Paul. Paul had raised the dead before, or at least the dead had been raised in his presence. The exact mechanism, whether it was Paul's power or God working through Paul, or God acting independently while Paul was present, was less important than the fact that it had happened. In other cities, in other circumstances, death had been reversed when Paul was there. But that didn't mean it would happen now. Miracles were not guaranteed. They couldn't be commanded or controlled. They happened when God chose to make them happen, according to purposes that were often inscrutable to the people involved. Paul knelt beside Eutychus. His knees settled onto the hard ground, stone or packed earth, cold despite the warmth of the day that had preceded this night. He looked at the young man's face, pale, still, unmarked by the violence of the fall but absent of life. The face of death is distinct. There's a quality to it, an emptiness that anyone who has seen it recognizes immediately. For a moment Paul said nothing. He simply placed his hands on Eutychus, one hand on his chest perhaps, and another on his shoulder or his head. Then, in a gesture that must have seemed strange to those watching, Paul leaned over Eutychus and embraced him. It was not a showy gesture. There were no grand declarations, no loud prayers shouted toward heaven, no commands issued with theatrical authority. Paul simply held the young man close, his body covering Eutychus's body, and spoke quietly, so quietly that only those closest could hear. The gesture itself was significant. It echoed moments from the Hebrew, scriptures, times when prophets had raised the dead by lying upon them, by breathing into them, by covering them with their own living bodies as if to transfer life from one person to another. Elijah had done this when he raised the widow's son. Elisha had done it when he raised the Shunammite woman's child. Now Paul was doing it for Eutychus, but Paul also spoke. And what he said was remarkable in its simplicity and its confidence. "Do not be troubled," Paul said. "His life is in him." The words hung in the air. Some people looked confused, others looked hopeful, a few looked sceptical, because the evidence of their eyes said otherwise. Eutychus was dead. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt the certainty of it. The man who had checked for a pulse had found none. The people who had looked for breath had found none. The body lying on the ground showed all the signs of death, the stillness, the pallor, the absolute absence of any spark of consciousness or animation. But Paul had said his life was in him. Present tense, not will be in him, or I hope will be in him, or may God restore his life to him. His life is in him, now, already, as a current fact. Paul stood, helping to lift Eutychus to his feet, and as he did, something impossible happened. Eutychus opened his eyes. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow return to consciousness like someone waking from deep sleep. One moment his eyes were closed, his face slack, his body lifeless. The next moment, his eyes were open, blinking, trying to focus on the faces surrounding him. He took a breath, a deep, sudden inhalation that filled his lungs completely. The kind of breath you take after being underwater too long, desperate and full and alive. His chest rose and fell, rose and fell. The rhythm of breathing, that most basic sign of life, resumed as if it had never stopped. He looked around at the crowd staring at him. His expression was one of confusion, disorientation, like someone waking from a dream and trying to figure out where they are and what just happened. He blinked several times, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight, his mind slowly catching up to his body. His legs moved, his arms moved. His body, which had been completely inert just moments before, now functioned, responded, lived. The crowd erupted. Some people shouted in amazement, their voices rising in wordless cries of joy and wonder. Others fell to their knees in worship, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. A few simply wept, their hands covering their faces, their bodies shaking with the release of emotion. This was not a resuscitation in the modern sense. This was not CPR or defibrillation or any medical intervention. This was death reversed, life restored where there had been none, a miracle without any natural explanation, performed not in a laboratory or a hospital, but on a dark street in a port city, while a crowd of believers watched in astonishment. Some people rushed forward to embrace Eutychus, others reached out to touch him, as if to verify that he was real, that this was actually happening. Eutychus, for his part, seemed overwhelmed. He was alive, yes, but he was also confused, shaken, trying to understand what had just occurred. Paul steadied him, helped him stand fully upright, checked to make sure he could walk. And then, in a move that must have seemed anticlimactic to those who were still processing what they had just seen, Paul simply helped Eutychus back toward the building, back up the stairs, back to the upper room, back to the gathering that had been so violently interrupted by his fall. And Paul, for his part, did not linger on the moment. He did not turn it into a spectacle. He did not gather the crowd for a celebration or deliver a triumphant sermon about the power of God. He simply helped Eutychus back upstairs, made sure he was settled and cared for, and then did something that no one expected. He returned to teaching. Chapter 7. A miracle without celebration. Back in the upper room, the atmosphere had changed completely. The lamp still burned, though some had gone out during the rush downstairs and needed to be relit. The air was still warm, though the door and windows had been left open during the commotion, letting in some of the cool night air. But the people who had rushed downstairs in panic now returned with something different in their eyes. Not just relief, but reverence. They had seen a dead man walk. They had witnessed something that defied every natural law they understood. They had looked into the face of death and then watched life return. That kind of experience changes people. It shakes them. It makes them more aware of the fragility of existence and the power of the God they claim to follow. Paul resumed his place near the centre of the room. Eutychus, though alive, was given space to rest. Some people brought him water, which he drank slowly, his hands still shaking slightly. Others sat near him, as if afraid that looking away might somehow undo what had just happened. But Paul did not dwell on the miracle. He did not pause to explain it or analyse it, or use it as a launching point for deeper teaching about death and resurrection. Instead, he broke bread. This was the heart of the gathering, the reason they had come together in the first place. The breaking of bread was not just a ritual, it was a remembrance, a participation, a way of saying that the body of Christ, broken for them on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem, was now their sustenance, their hope, their life. The practice had been instituted by Jesus himself on the night before his crucifixion. He had taken bread, given thanks for it, broken it, and given it to his disciples with the words, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he had taken a cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." In the early church, this practice was central to their gatherings. It wasn't a sombre, silent ritual performed once a month or once a quarter. It was a regular part of their communal life, a meal shared, a covenant remembered, a way of saying we are one body, broken and poured out for the world. Paul took the bread, likely a simple loaf made from wheat or barley flour, the kind of bread that ordinary people ate every day. He gave thanks. This was important. Not a perfunctory blessing, but a genuine expression of gratitude. Thanks for this bread. Thanks for this community. Thanks for this life. Thanks for Jesus, whose death and resurrection made all of this possible. Then he broke it. The action itself was symbolic. The breaking represented Christ's body broken on the cross. But it was also practical. Bread had to be broken to be shared. It had to be torn apart so that everyone could partake. He passed the pieces among the believers, and they ate together, quietly, reverently, in the presence of something they could not fully explain, but could not deny. They ate in the presence of Eutychus, who should have been dead but was alive. They ate in the presence of Paul, who would soon leave them and might never return. They ate in the presence of the God who had, just moments ago, demonstrated his power in the most undeniable way possible. And then, after the bread was eaten and the cup was shared, Paul did something that must have seemed almost unbelievable. He continued speaking. It would have been easy to stop there, to call it a night, to let everyone go home and process what had just happened, to give people space to deal with the emotional whiplash of going from grief to joy, from death to life, from despair to hope. But Paul knew his time was short. He knew he would be gone in the morning. He knew that these people needed more than a miracle. They needed truth. They needed teaching. They needed to understand that God's power was not just for moments of crisis, but for the long, ordinary, difficult work of living, faithfully in a world that did not yet understand what they believed. So he spoke, and he kept speaking, through the middle of the night, through the hours when most people would have been asleep in their beds, through the quiet, sacred space that exists between midnight and dawn. No one left. No one fell asleep again. The room was more attentive now, more awake, not because they were afraid of falling, though surely some people had moved away from the windows and planted themselves more firmly on the floor, but because they understood, in a way they hadn't before, that this moment mattered. They had been reminded in the most visceral way possible that life is fragile, that death is real, that tomorrow is not guaranteed. And because of that, the words Paul spoke now felt more urgent, more precious, more worth holding on to. The miracle of Eutychus's resurrection had not been performed for show. It had not been done to prove Paul's credentials or to impress the crowd or to give people something exciting to talk about. It had been done because God, in his mercy, had chosen to give a young man his life back, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone present that he was still in the business of bringing life out of death, hope out of despair, light out of darkness. But the teaching continued because miracles by themselves are not enough. Spectacular displays of power might grab attention, might generate excitement, might even produce temporary faith. But lasting transformation, the kind that sustains people through persecution and hardship and doubt, comes from understanding, from teaching, from the slow, patient work of having truth soak into your mind and heart until it changes the way you see everything. So Paul taught, and the people listened. Chapter 8. Teaching until morning. The lessons Paul shared that night have not been recorded. We do not know the specific words he used, the stories he told, the scriptures he referenced. The biblical account is silent on the content of his teaching after Eutychus's resurrection. We know only that he spoke until dawn, and that when morning came, he left. But we know Paul. We know his mind, his heart, his priorities. We know what mattered to him, what drove him, what he considered essential for believers to understand. And from his letters, those passionate, urgent, deeply theological documents he wrote to other churches, we can get a sense of what he might have said that night in Troas. He would have spoken about grace. This was Paul's central theme, the drumbeat that ran through everything he taught. Grace meant that you didn't have to earn God's love. You couldn't earn it. The entire system of trying to make yourself acceptable to God through good behaviour, through religious ritual, through moral achievement, it was all beside the point. God's love was freely given, not because you were good enough or righteous enough or had followed enough rules, but simply because God had chosen to love you. This was a radical message in the ancient world. Every religion, every philosophical system, every moral framework operated on some version of merit. You did certain things, and the gods, if you had done them correctly, would do certain things for you. It was transactional, conditional, always uncertain, because you could never be sure if you had done enough. But Paul said that God's love didn't work that way. It wasn't based on your performance. It was based on what Christ had done, his perfect life, his substitutionary death, his resurrection. You received it not by achieving it, but by trusting it, by believing that what God said was true, and letting that truth transform you from the inside out. He would have spoken about the resurrection, not just Christ's resurrection, but the promise of resurrection for all believers. This was more than a comforting thought about the afterlife. In a culture where life was brutal and short, where infant mortality was devastating, where plagues could wipe out entire families, where war and violence were constants, the promise of resurrection was revolutionary. It meant that death was not the end, that the people you loved who had died were not simply gone, that the injustices of this world, the cruelty, the oppression, the suffering would not stand forever, that God was making all things new, and that included making dead bodies alive again. And tonight they had seen a preview of that promise. Eutychus had died and returned. Not permanently, he would die again one day, as all humans do. But for now, in this moment, they had witnessed the power of resurrection. They had seen death reversed, and that gave weight to Paul's words about the future resurrection in a way that abstract teaching never could. He would have spoken about community, about how the church was not just a building or a meeting or an institution, but a living body made up of ordinary people trying to follow an extraordinary God. In his letters, Paul often used the metaphor of the body to describe the church. Each person was a different part, an eye, a hand, a foot, an ear, all different, all necessary, all dependent on each other. This was important because it meant that no one was disposable. Eutychus was not just some random young man who happened to fall from a window. He was part of the body. And when one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. When one part is restored, the whole body rejoices. Paul would have reminded them that they were responsible for each other, that they were called to bear one another's burdens, to encourage one another, to care for the weak and vulnerable among them, that following Jesus was not an individualistic enterprise, but a communal one. He would have spoken about perseverance, about staying faithful even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when the world around you doesn't understand. Because faith is not always tested in moments of danger. Sometimes it's tested in moments of exhaustion, in the quiet, unremarkable hours when no one is watching, and the only thing keeping you going is the belief that what you're doing matters. Eutychus had fallen asleep during Paul's teaching. That was not a moral failure. It was not a sign of rebellion or lack of devotion. It was simply what happens when a human body is pushed past its limits, and God had not punished him for it. He had restored him. That was a powerful message for everyone in that room, because they were all tired. They were all struggling. They were all trying to live faithfully in a world that was often hostile to their faith, and they needed to know that God's grace was sufficient for their weakness, that he didn't expect them to be superhuman, that he met them in their limitations and gave them what they needed to keep going. Paul would have spoken about the cost of following Jesus. He never sugarcoated this. He knew that persecution was coming. He knew that some of the people in that room would be arrested, beaten, imprisoned, or killed because of their faith. He himself had experienced all of these things, and he would experience more before his life was over. But he also knew that the cost was worth it, that knowing Jesus, being part of his kingdom, having hope beyond this world, all of that was worth whatever suffering it might entail. Paul had given up everything, his status, his reputation, his comfort, his security, to follow Jesus, and he had never regretted it. He would have spoken about the Holy Spirit, that mysterious, powerful presence of God that indwelled every believer. The Spirit was not just a theological concept, it was a living reality, the presence of God within you, changing you, empowering you, guiding you, comforting you. The Spirit was how Jesus could be present with them even after his ascension. The Spirit was how they could have courage to face persecution. The Spirit was how they could love people who hated them, forgive people who hurt them, and keep hoping when everything seemed hopeless. Paul spoke until dawn, until the darkness outside the windows began to fade, until the first pale grey light of morning began to seep into the eastern sky, until the lamps, which had burned all night, began to seem unnecessary in the growing light. The people in that room were exhausted, physically drained from the emotional rollercoaster of the night, but they were also filled, not with information, though they had certainly learned much, but with something deeper, something that information alone could never provide. They were filled with the sense that they had been in the presence of something holy, that they had witnessed something that mattered, that they had been reminded in the most powerful way possible that the God they served was real and present and active in their lives. And then, finally, Paul stopped. Not because he had run out of things to say, Paul could always find more to say, but because it was time. Time for him to leave, time for them to return to their lives, time for the ordinary world to resume. Chapter 9. The young man walks home. Eutychus walked home that morning like any other young man. His legs worked, his heart beat, his lungs filled with air. To anyone who saw him on the street, a merchant opening his shop, a fisherman heading down to the docks, a woman drawing water from a well, he would have looked completely ordinary. Just another person starting another day. But Eutychus knew what had happened. He knew he had fallen. He knew he had died. And he knew that somehow, impossibly, he had been brought back. What do you feel when you've been dead and then returned to life? What thoughts go through your mind? What does the world look like when you've crossed that final threshold and then been pulled back across it? We don't know. Eutychus never wrote about his experience. Unlike some people in Scripture who were raised from the dead and whose reactions were recorded, we have no account of what Eutychus thought or felt. We don't know if he remembered anything from the time he was dead. We don't know if he saw anything, heard anything, experienced anything in that space between death and resurrection. What we do know is that he lived. He walked home. He returned to his ordinary life. And in doing so, he became a living testimony to the grace of God. The story of that night would follow him for the rest of his life. Not as a burden, but as a testimony. People would ask him about it, certainly. What do you remember? What did it feel like to die? What did Paul say? Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? What was it like when you came back? And Eutychus, in his own way, would try to answer. But some experiences resist language. Some moments are too large, too strange, too holy to fit into words. How do you describe the transition from life to death? How do you explain the sensation of consciousness returning after it has completely ceased? How do you convey to someone who has never died what death is actually like? You can't. Not really. You can use metaphors and approximations. You can describe feelings and sensations. But the thing itself, the actual experience, remains fundamentally incommunicable. What mattered was not that Eutychus became famous. He didn't. His name appears only once in Scripture, in a single passage, in a single story. He did not become a leader of the church. He did not write letters or perform miracles or travel the world preaching. As far as we know, he never left Troas. He simply lived there, worked there, worshipped there, and eventually died there. Really died, the kind of death that this time would be permanent. But in the meantime, he carried the knowledge that God's grace had met him in his weakest moment. Not to shame him, not to punish him, not to make an example of him, but to restore him. Eutychus had not fallen because of rebellion. He had not turned away from God or rejected the faith or chosen disobedience. He had simply been human, tired, overwhelmed, unable to keep his eyes open in a warm room late at night. These are not sins. They are simply the limitations of being human, of having a body that needs rest. of having finite energy and attention. And God, rather than punishing him for those limitations, had given him his life back. That was the real miracle. Not just that death was reversed, though that was miraculous enough, but that grace was extended. That a young man who had done nothing heroic, nothing spectacular, nothing worthy of special recognition, except show up and try his best, was deemed worthy of God's intervention. Eutychus had simply been present. He had come to the meeting. He had listened as long as he could. He had positioned himself where he could hear Paul's teaching. He had stayed when he could have left. And when his body finally gave out, when sleep finally overtook him, when he fell and died, God had not abandoned him. That was the message Eutychus carried for the rest of his life. Not look what I did, but look what was done for me. Not I am special, but God is gracious. Not I earned this, but I was given this. And perhaps that's why this story matters. Perhaps that's why it was included in the book of Acts, preserved for centuries, passed down through generations. Not because Eutychus was exceptional, but because he was ordinary. He was like most of us, trying his best, sometimes failing, sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes so tired that he couldn't keep his eyes open even when he desperately wanted to. And the message of his story is this: God meets you there, in your tiredness, in your limitations, in your human frailty. He doesn't wait until you've gotten yourself together, until you've become strong enough, or devoted enough, or spiritual enough. He meets you right where you are. Eutychus walked home that morning. The sun was rising over the Aegean Sea, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The streets of Troas were beginning to fill with people starting their day. The smell of bread baking, the sound of merchants setting up their stalls, the sight of ships in the harbour preparing to sail, all of it was ordinary, familiar, the same as it had been every other morning. But Eutychus was different. Not outwardly. He looked the same, sounded the same, moved through the world the same way he always had. But inwardly he carried a knowledge that would shape the rest of his life. He had died, and he had been brought back. And in that experience, he had learned something about the God he served, something about grace, something about mercy, something about how God sees human weakness not as something to be punished, but as something to be met with compassion. That knowledge would sustain him through whatever came next, through the ordinary struggles of daily life, through the challenges of living as a Christian in a Roman world, through the moments of doubt and fear and exhaustion that every believer faces, because he knew in the deepest part of himself that God was not a distant judge waiting to condemn him for his failures. God was a present help, a restorer of life, a source of grace that flowed freely, abundantly, even to young men who fell asleep at the wrong moment. Eutychus walked home, and in walking he carried a truth that the church would need for generations to come. Epilogue, grace for the tired. The story of Eutychus is not often told. It does not appear in children's Bible storybooks or on felt boards in Sunday school classrooms. It is not the subject of famous paintings or inspiring movies or best-selling novels. It does not have the drama of Daniel in the lion's den, or the heroism of David facing Goliath, or the spectacle of the walls of Jericho falling down. It is a small story, tucked away in the 20th chapter of the book of Acts, easy to overlook in the rush toward more dramatic moments, just a few verses, just a brief incident during one of Paul's many journeys, just a young man falling asleep and falling from a window and being restored to life. But perhaps that is exactly why it matters, because most of life is not dramatic. Most of life is not heroic battles or miraculous escapes or grand declarations of faith. Most of life is ordinary people trying to stay awake in warm rooms, trying to be present when they're exhausted, trying to listen when their mind's drifting, trying to hold on when everything in them wants to let go. Most of life is Eutychus sitting in a window, doing his best and failing anyway. And the message of this story, the deep, beautiful, necessary message, is that God does not withdraw from you when you're weary. He meets you there. He does not demand that you be strong before he will help you. He does not require that you prove your devotion, that you stay awake through every sermon, that you never falter or fail or fall. He does not judge you for having a body that needs rest, or a mind that gets tired, or limitations that are simply part of being human. He simply asks that you show up, that you try, that you place yourself as best you can in the presence of what is true and good and life-giving. And when you fall, because you will fall, because all humans do, he does not leave you lying on the ground. He comes down. He embraces you. He speaks life back into your weary bones. The story of Eutychus is not a story about perfection. It is a story about grace, about a God who sees you in your tiredness, in your weakness, in your most ordinary and unremarkable moments, and says, "You are still mine. You are still loved. You are still worthy of life." This is particularly important for us to remember because we live in a culture that glorifies strength, that celebrates people who never need help, who never get tired, who push through pain and exhaustion and keep going no matter what. We are told that if we just try harder, do more, optimize lives better, we can overcome our limitations. But the story of Eutychus says something different. It says that sometimes you can't stay awake no matter how hard you try. Sometimes exhaustion wins, sometimes you fall. And that's okay, because God's grace is not just for the strong, it's especially for the weak. The Apostle Paul himself wrote about this in one of his letters. He described having a thorn in the flesh, some kind of physical ailment or limitation that he asked God to remove. And God's response was not to remove it, but to say, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul learned to embrace his weakness because it created space for God's power to work, and perhaps that's what happened with Eutychus too. His weakness, his inability to stay awake, his failure to maintain his balance, his fall from the window, created space for God's grace to be displayed. Not because God caused him to fall, not because God wanted him to die, but because in this moment of human frailty, God chose to demonstrate his power and his compassion in a way that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. The believers in Troas learned something that night that they would not have learned otherwise. They learned that God cares about ordinary people in ordinary moments, that miracles are not just for prophets and apostles and heroes of faith, that grace extends to young men who fall asleep at the wrong time, and they learned that death is not the end. They already believed in resurrection. That was central to their faith. But belief is different from experience. They had heard Paul teach about Jesus rising from the dead. They believed it was true, but that night they saw death reversed with their own eyes. They saw a young man who was dead become alive again. And that experience transformed abstract belief into concrete knowledge. Paul left Troas that morning and continued his journey. The believers returned to their lives, to their work, their families, their daily struggles. The upper room was cleaned, the lamps were put away. The memory of that night began to fade into the background of everyday life. But the grace remained. It always does. Grace doesn't depend on our ability to stay awake or keep our balance or avoid making mistakes. It doesn't depend on our strength or our devotion or our performance. It depends only on the character of the God who gives it. And the God who gave Eutychus his life back is the same God who meets us in our weakness today. The same God who doesn't require us to be perfect before he will love us. The same God who sees our exhaustion, our limitations, our failures, and responds not with judgment but with compassion. Eutychus fell asleep. He fell from a window. He died, and he was restored. Not because he deserved it, not because he earned it, not because he was special or extraordinary or particularly holy, but because God is gracious. That's the story. That's the whole story. The young man fell asleep, and God in his mercy gave him back his life. The lamps in the upper room were extinguished. The bread was eaten. The night was over. Dawn broke over Troas, painting the sky with light, promising a new day. But the grace remained. It always does. And it's available to you too. Right now, in this moment, whether you're tired or strong, failing or succeeding, falling or standing firm, God's grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in weakness, and he meets you exactly where you are. That's what the story of Eutychus teaches us. That's what it has been teaching believers for 2,000 years, and that's what it will continue to teach for as long as people need to hear it. Grace for the tired, life for the dead, hope for the weary, love for the falling. This is the heart of the gospel. This is what Jesus came to bring. Not a new set of rules to follow or a higher standard to achieve, but grace, unearned, undeserved, freely given. Eutychus received it that night in Troas. Paul proclaimed it throughout his ministry. The early church lived by it, and it's still available today. So if you're tired tonight, know that God sees you. If you're struggling to keep your eyes open, to stay present, to hold on, know that God's grace is sufficient. If you've fallen, if you've failed, if you feel like you're barely holding on, know that God has not abandoned you. He comes down, He embraces you, He speaks life into your weariness, just as He did for a young man named Eutychus 2,000 years ago in an upper room in Troas. The grace remains. It always does. If you're enjoying this story and finding value in this content, using your hype points on this video truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It makes a genuine difference in reaching more listeners like you. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much and means the world to us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It really connects us all. And if you enjoy this content and want more stories like this, consider subscribing. It keeps these stories coming. Now, let's begin. There are moments in history when everything hangs in the balance. Not because of armies marching or treaties being signed, but because one person, in one quiet moment, decides to do what is right. We remember the names of kings. We study the words of prophets. We build monuments to warriors and write songs about heroes. But there are others, people whose names we barely know, whose faces history never captured, whose courage was shown not on battlefields, but in small, deliberate acts of mercy. This is the story of one such person, a man with no power, no title, no protection, a foreigner in a land that was not his own, serving in a palace where he had no voice. And yet, when the moment came, when a life hung in the balance and everyone else turned away, he stepped forward. This is not a story of miracles or divine intervention arriving in thunder and light. This is a story about a choice made in fear, in uncertainty, with no guarantee of safety, a choice that would echo through generations, remembered not because it was grand, but because it was good. History is filled with dramatic turning points, battles that decided the fate of nations, treaties that redrew the maps of continents, speeches that inspired revolutions. These are the moments we teach in schools, the stories we tell our children, the events we commemorate with holidays and statues. But between those grand moments, in the spaces where history books grow quiet, there are other stories, smaller stories. Stories of individuals who faced impossible choices with no witnesses, no cameras, no guarantee that anyone would remember what they did. These are the stories that reveal who we really are. Anyone can be brave when the world is watching. Anyone can do the right thing when there are rewards waiting, when there is applause, when there is safety in numbers. But what about when no one is watching? What about when doing the right thing costs everything and gains nothing? What about when the choice is between your safety and someone else's life? That is when character is tested. That is when we discover what we truly believe. And that is exactly the kind of moment that defines this story. This is the story of Ebed-Melech, the man who saved a prophet. And it begins in a city on the edge of destruction. Chapter 1. Jerusalem on the Brink. Jerusalem in those days was a city suffocating under its own fear. The walls still stood, massive and ancient, built from limestone blocks that had withstood centuries of wind and rain. The temple still rose above the rooftops, its stones catching the morning light, its courts still filled with priests performing their rituals, its altars still receiving the sacrifices of a people who desperately hoped God was still listening. Markets still opened each morning, merchants still called out their wares, though the prices grew higher with each passing week. Children still played in the narrow streets between houses. From a distance, from the hills surrounding the city, you might think nothing had changed. But inside those walls, everyone knew the truth. Babylon was coming. No, Babylon was already here. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was camped outside the gates, their armies stretched across the landscape like a dark sea that had no end. Their siege engines stood ready, enormous wooden structures that towered over the walls, mechanisms of destruction built by engineers who had conquered city after city, who knew exactly how to break stone and shatter gates and reduce proud civilizations to rubble. Their soldiers waited with the patience of men who knew the outcome was already decided. They did not need to attack yet. They could simply wait. Wait for the food to run out. Wait for the water to run low. Wait for disease and hunger and despair to do their work. They had time. Jerusalem did not. It was not a question of if Jerusalem would fall. It was a question of when. And everyone inside those walls knew it. You could see it in the faces of the people, the way they moved through the streets with their eyes down, their voices quiet, their steps hurried. The way mothers held their children a little tighter, the way men gathered in doorways speaking in low tones, glancing over, their shoulders, afraid even their words might bring trouble. The city had become a pressure vessel, sealed tight, with no release. Fear had a way of building in enclosed spaces. It pressed down on people, made them desperate, made them turn on each other. When there is no external enemy you can reach, you find enemies within. Inside the city, the people were divided. Some believed they could negotiate. There were diplomats who thought if they could just get a message to the Babylonian king, if they could offer tribute, if they could make the right promises, perhaps the city could be spared. They remembered that Jerusalem had survived threats before. Surely God would not allow his holy city to fall. Some believed they could fight. There were soldiers, younger men mostly, who argued that the walls had never been breached, that they had supplies enough for months if they rationed carefully, that the Babylonians would eventually give up and move on to easier targets. They spoke of heroic last stands, of glory in battle, of dying with honour rather than surrendering to pagans. Some believed God would intervene at the last moment, as he had done before. They told stories of the night when the Assyrian army had camped outside these same walls more than a century earlier, and how an angel of the Lord had struck down thousands of enemy soldiers in a single night, and how the Assyrian king had fled back to his own land in terror and shame. If God had done it once, surely he would do it again. Surely he would not abandon his people. Surely deliverance was coming. But these were the desperate hopes of people who had run out of options. The rational voices, the ones who looked at the situation clearly and honestly, knew better. They knew that Babylon was not Assyria. They knew that this time was different. They knew that Jerusalem had brought this upon itself through years of rebellion, of ignoring warnings, of breaking covenants, of turning away from the very God. They now begged to save them. And then there was Jeremiah. The prophet had been warning them for years, not months, not weeks, years. His message had never changed. Not once. Not even when it made him hated. Not even when it made him a target. Not even when it would have been so much easier to tell the people what they wanted to hear. Repent. Turn back to God. Surrender to Babylon, because judgment has already been decided. If you surrender, you will live. If you resist, you will die. It was not a popular message. The officials hated him. They saw him as a traitor, a defeatist, a man who was actively working to undermine the city's defence. How could he tell people to surrender? How could he say that resistance was futile? How could he claim to speak for God while advocating for submission to a pagan empire? The priests dismissed him. They performed their rituals, they offered their sacrifices, they assured the people that God would protect his temple. They had their position, their authority, their comfortable certainty. Jeremiah threatened all of that with his message of judgment and destruction. The people called him a coward. They wanted a prophet who would promise victory, who would assure them that righteousness would triumph, who would tell them that their suffering had meaning and that rescue was coming. Jeremiah offered none of that. He offered only the hard truth. You are being destroyed because you have abandoned God, and your only hope now is to accept the consequences of your choices. But Jeremiah kept speaking. He had no choice. The word of the Lord burned inside him like a fire, and he could not hold it in. He stood in the courtyards of the temple. He walked through the streets of the city. He spoke to anyone who would listen, and to many who would not. And his words were always the same. This is what the Lord says: surrender and live. Resist and die. He did not soften the message. He did not try to make it more palatable. He simply delivered what he had been given to say, regardless of the cost, and the cost was high. People spat at him when he passed. Children threw stones. He was arrested repeatedly, beaten, imprisoned. His own family turned against him. His fellow priests sought to silence him. He was forbidden from entering the temple. He was isolated, despised, rejected by the very people he was trying to save, and still he kept speaking. Because that is what prophets do. They speak the truth even when the truth is unbearable. They deliver the message even when the message is rejected. They stand in the gap between God and humanity and bear the weight of both. But there comes a point when patience runs out, when fear overrides reason, when desperate people do desperate things. The officials grew tired of Jeremiah's voice. In a time of war, words like his were dangerous. They weakened morale. They sowed doubt among the soldiers. They made people question whether the fight was worth it. They planted seeds of surrender in hearts that needed to remain strong. The city was already fragile, already divided, already terrified. The last thing they needed was a prophet of doom walking the streets, telling everyone that resistance was pointless. So the officials made a decision. They went to the king. Chapter 2. Jeremiah Condemned. King Zedekiah sat on his throne in the palace, surrounded by advisors, military commanders, and officials who all claimed to know what was best for the city. But the truth was, none of them knew. No one had ever faced a situation quite like this. No one had a clear answer, and Zedekiah himself was perhaps the least equipped person in the entire city to lead them through this crisis. He was a weak man. History would remember him that way, not cruel necessarily, not malicious, just weak. He had been placed on the throne by the Babylonians years earlier, after they had deposed the previous king. He was a puppet and everyone knew it. He had no real authority, no real power. He ruled at the pleasure of the very empire that was now trying to destroy him. He lived in constant fear. Fear of the Babylonians, fear of his own officials, fear of the people, fear of the prophets, fear of God. He feared everything, and so he did nothing. He was a man trapped between impossible choices, unable to commit to any of them. When Jeremiah had first begun prophesying surrender, Zedekiah had secretly consulted with him. Late at night, when no one else could see, the king would send for the prophet and ask him privately what God was saying, and Jeremiah would tell him the same thing he told everyone else: surrender to Babylon, and you will live. Resist, and you will die. But Zedekiah could not bring himself to do it. To surrender would be to admit defeat, to humiliate himself before the very empire that had made him king. It would be to betray the trust of his officials, his soldiers, his people. It would be to guarantee that history would remember him as the king who gave up without a fight. So he did nothing. He allowed the officials to continue their plans for resistance. He allowed the priests to continue promising divine deliverance. He allowed the situation to deteriorate day by day, unable to make the hard choice that might have saved thousands of lives. And then the officials came to him with a proposal. There were 4 of them: Shephatiah son of Mattain, Gedaliah son of Pasha, Jehukal son of Shelemiah, Pasha son of Malchijah, men of influence, men who had the king's ear, men who had made their position clear. "My lord king," they said, their voices respectful but firm, "we must speak with you about Jeremiah the prophet." Zedekiah shifted in his seat. He knew where this was going. He had been dreading this conversation. "What about him?" the king asked, though he already knew. "He continues to prophesy defeat," one of them said. "He tells the soldiers that anyone who stays in the city will die by sword, or famine, or plague, but anyone who goes over to the Babylonians will live. He is actively encouraging desertion. He is undermining the defense of this city. He tells the people that this city will certainly be given into the hands of the king of Babylon's army," another added. "He offers no hope, no encouragement, only doom." The king was silent. What could he say? Everything they said was true. Jeremiah was saying exactly those things, but Jeremiah claimed to speak for God. And if he truly spoke for God, then what right did anyone have to silence him? "This man should be put to death," the officials said, their tone leaving no room for debate. "He is discouraging the soldiers and all the people with his words. He does not seek the good of this city, but its ruin. He is a traitor, my lord, and traitors, especially in wartime, deserve death." There it was. The request was clear. They wanted permission to execute Jeremiah, and they were essentially telling the king that if he did not give that permission, they would question his loyalty to the city. Zedekiah felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. If he protected Jeremiah, he would anger the officials, lose what little authority he had left, and possibly spark internal conflict at the worst possible time. If he condemned Jeremiah, he would be silencing a prophet of God, and what would the consequences of that be? He took the coward's way out. "He is in your hands," Zedekiah said quietly, not meeting their eyes. "The king can do nothing to oppose you." It was a masterpiece of political cowardice. He did not give explicit permission. He did not order Jeremiah's death. He simply removed himself from the equation, claimed powerlessness, and allowed the officials to do whatever they wanted. It was permission by abdication. The officials bowed and left immediately. They had what they needed. They came for Jeremiah in the early morning, when the city was just beginning to wake. There was no public announcement, no formal charges, no opportunity for defence. This was not a trial. It was an execution. But they could not simply kill him outright. There were still people in the city who respected the prophet, who believed his words might be true. An obvious execution could spark unrest. So they chose a method that would be slower, quieter, more deniable. They would bury him alive. The guards surrounded Jeremiah where he had been confined in the courtyard of the guard. He did not resist. He had long ago accepted that his calling would likely cost him his life. He had made peace with that possibility years earlier. They led him through the streets, past people who watched from doorways but said nothing. Some pitied him, some hated him, some feared him. Most were simply too afraid to intervene, too worn down by their own suffering to care about anyone else's. They brought him to the courtyard of the guard, where a large cistern stood, a deep pit that had been carved into the rock to collect rainwater during the wet season. It was an old cistern, one that had been there for generations. During times of plenty it would fill with fresh water. But there had been no rain for months. The cistern was nearly empty. What remained at the bottom was not water. It was mud. Thick, black, clinging mud that had accumulated over years. The residue of countless rainstorms mixed with dirt and debris that had fallen in, fermented by time and heat into something foul and suffocating. The kind of mud that pulls at your legs when you step into it, that sucks at your feet and drags you down slowly inch by inch. The kind of mud that can swallow a man whole. They tied ropes around Jeremiah's arms and lowered him into the cistern. The opening was narrow, perhaps a metre across. The sides were slick limestone, impossible to climb. The depth was perhaps 10 metres, maybe more. Jeremiah went down slowly, spinning slightly as the ropes unwound. The circle of sky above him grew smaller and smaller. The sounds of the city faded, and then his feet touched the surface of the mud. It was cold, shockingly cold, and immediately he felt it pulling at him, clinging to his legs, resisting every attempt to move, and then they let go. The ropes were pulled back up, slithering against the stone walls. The sound of footsteps faded, voices grew distant, and Jeremiah was left alone in the pit, slowly sinking into the cold, suffocating earth. There was no food, no water, no light except the narrow circle of sky far above, so distant it might as well have been the moon. The walls were slick and impossible to climb. Even if he had the strength, there was nothing to grip, no way to ascend. The mud rose to his thighs, then his waist, holding him in place like a living tomb. He could not sit. The mud would engulf him. He could not lie down. He could only stand, muscles straining, fighting against the constant pull of the earth, and wait for the end. The cold seeped into his bones. His legs began to ache. Hours passed. The circle of sky above darkened as clouds moved across the sun, then brightened again. Time lost meaning. He prayed. What else could he do? He prayed not for rescue. He had learned long ago not to assume God would spare him from suffering, but for strength to endure, for peace in his final hours, for forgiveness for those who had done this to him. And above him, the city went on with its life. People bought bread in the markets, though it cost more each day. Soldiers stood watch on the walls, squinting at the Babylonian armies camped in the distance. Officials made plans, held meetings, argued about strategy. Priests performed sacrifices in the temple, assuring worshippers that God would protect them. And a prophet of God was buried alive beneath their feet, and no one did anything. The mud continued to pull at him. His legs trembled with exhaustion. The cold became unbearable, thirst began to claw at his throat. And still, no one came. But someone noticed. Thus, Chapter 3. The outsider who notices his name was Ebed-Melech. The name itself is interesting. In Hebrew it means servant of the king. It might not have been his birth name at all, but rather a title, a designation of his role. We do not know his original name. We do not know when he came to Jerusalem or how he ended up in the king's service. What we do know is that he was not from Jerusalem. He was not from Judah. He was not even from anywhere nearby. He was from Cush, what we now call Ethiopia, though the ancient borders were different, encompassing regions that today include Sudan and parts of Egypt. It was a land far to the south, beyond the deserts and the great river Nile, a place most people in Jerusalem had only heard about in stories. His skin was darker than those around him. His features were different. His accent, when he spoke Hebrew, marked him immediately as foreign. He stood out in every crowd, not by choice, but by the simple fact of his existence in a place where he did not naturally belong. He was a servant in the king's household. The text specifies that he was a eunuch, which tells us several important things. First, it means he had been taken from his homeland, almost certainly as a young man, possibly even as a boy. This was common practice in ancient times. Conquered peoples, subject nations, and those seeking favour with powerful kingdoms would sometimes send young men to serve in foreign courts. These young men would be castrated to ensure they could be trusted around the royal household, particularly the king's wives and concubines, and then trained for service. It was a brutal practice, one that robbed these men not only of their bodily autonomy, but of any hope for a normal life. They would never have families, never have children, never have the future that most people took for granted. They existed in a strange liminal space, neither slave nor free, neither citizen nor foreigner, neither man nor something else. They were invisible in a sense. People looked through them rather than at them. They were functionaries, tools, useful objects that performed necessary tasks, but were not considered fully human in the way that other people were. Ebed-Melech would have understood what it meant to be powerless. He lived it every day. He had no family in Jerusalem, no wife, no children, no brothers or cousins or uncles who might support him or defend him. He had no inheritance waiting for him, no land, no wealth of his own, Everything he had, his clothes, his food, his very place to sleep, existed at the pleasure of the king. He could be dismissed at any moment, sold, cast out, and if that happened, where would he go? Back to Cush, after years or even decades away. He would be a stranger there too, marked by his time in a foreign land, altered in ways that would make him an outsider even in his homeland. He was utterly vulnerable. And yet somehow he had retained something that many others had lost. He had retained his conscience. He had retained the ability to see suffering and be moved by it, to recognise injustice and be troubled by it, to witness cruelty and refuse to accept it as normal. This is not as common as we might think. People can become numb to suffering, especially when surrounded by it constantly. When you see injustice every day, when cruelty becomes routine, when you yourself are powerless and vulnerable, there is a strong temptation to simply accept it, to tell yourself that this is how the world works, that there is nothing you can do, that your own survival must be your only priority. But Ebed-Melech had not become numb. Perhaps it was because he knew what it was like to be the one suffering. Perhaps it was because he had experienced what it meant to be overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. Perhaps it was because, as a foreigner, as a servant, as a eunuch, he had learned to pay attention to people that others ignored. Or perhaps it was simply that he believed in God, and that belief had shaped him into someone who could not look away from evil. We do not know exactly how Ebed-Melech learned that Jeremiah had been thrown into the cistern. The text does not tell us, but somehow he heard. Perhaps he overheard the officials talking about it, their voices carrying through the corridors of the palace as they congratulated themselves on solving the problem of the troublesome prophet. Perhaps a guard mentioned it in passing, complaining about having to lower the old man into the pit. Perhaps he simply noticed that Jeremiah, who had been confined in the courtyard of the guard, was no longer visible, and he asked where the prophet had gone. However it happened, Ebed-Melech learned the truth. Jeremiah had been thrown into the cistern, left to sink into the mud, left to die slowly of hunger and cold and exhaustion. And unlike everyone else in that city who knew what had happened, Ebed-Melech was disturbed by it. Not just concerned, not just uncomfortable, disturbed, because he recognised it for what it was. Murder. Slow, cruel, deniable murder. And he could not accept it. The easiest thing to do would have been to stay silent, to tell himself it was not his business, that Jeremiah had brought this on himself with his controversial prophecies, that the officials knew what they were doing, that a foreign servant had no right to question the decisions of Judean leaders. He could have reminded himself that he was powerless, that speaking up would only bring trouble, that he had no authority, no influence, no protection, that if he made himself a problem, he could easily end up in that cistern beside Jeremiah, or worse. He could have done what everyone else was doing, looked away, kept his head down, focused on his own survival, but he did not. Because knowing something is wrong is one thing, doing something about it is another thing, and Ebed-Melech made a choice. Chapter 4. A risky decision. The choice to act is never simple when acting puts you in danger. Ebed-Melech knew what he was risking. He understood the dynamics of power in the palace. He knew that the officials who had condemned Jeremiah were powerful men with connections, men who could make life very difficult for anyone who opposed them. He knew that speaking up meant making himself visible in a way that servants were never supposed to be visible. It meant drawing attention to himself, stepping out of his assigned role, asserting a moral authority that society said he did not have. He knew that questioning the officials' decision could be seen as questioning their wisdom, their judgment, even their loyalty to the city. And in a time of war, such questions could be interpreted as treason. But he also knew that if he did nothing, Jeremiah would die. Perhaps he had seen the prophet from a distance, heard him speaking in the courtyards, witnessed the courage it took to keep delivering an unpopular message day after day despite the hatred and violence it brought. Perhaps he admired that kind of integrity, that kind of commitment to truth regardless of cost. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps he just could not bear the thought of a man dying slowly in the dark, alone, abandoned, while the world went on above him. So Ebed-melech made his choice. He would go to the king. This was not a small decision. Approaching the king directly was something servants simply did not do. There were protocols, hierarchies, chains of command. You did not just walk up to the king and start talking. Especially not about a matter as sensitive as this. Especially not in contradiction to the official's decision. But Ebed-melech knew that if he went through proper channels, his request would be blocked. The officials would ensure that the king never heard about it, or they would frame it in a way that made Ebed-melech seem presumptuous, disloyal, dangerous. No, if he was going to do this, he had to do it directly. He had to find a moment when the king was accessible, and he had to speak before anyone could stop him. That moment came when King Zedekiah was sitting in the Benjamin Gate. The Benjamin Gate was the main entrance to the city, located on the northern side. It was not just a gate, but a complex structure with rooms and chambers where legal matters were conducted, where the king would sometimes hold court, where public business was transacted. Zedekiah was there that day, surrounded by advisors and officials conducting the routine business of a city under siege. There were disputes to settle, resources to allocate, reports to hear. Ebed-melech walked toward the gate with his heart pounding. Every step felt weighted with consequence. He could turn back. No one would blame him. No one expected him to do this. But he kept walking. When he reached the gate, he saw the king seated with his counselors around him. The same officials who had condemned Jeremiah were there. Shephatiah, Gedaliah, Jehukal, Pashur. They stood near the king, speaking in low tones, their body language relaxed and confident. Ebed-melech approached. Heads turned, conversations paused. Who was this servant, and why was he interrupting? But before anyone could stop him, Ebed-melech spoke. "My lord the king." His voice was steady, despite the fear coursing through him. This was the moment. There was no going back now. Zedekiah looked up, surprised. "Yes? What is it?" Ebed-melech did not hesitate. He knew that if he paused, if he showed any uncertainty, he would be dismissed immediately. So he spoke clearly, firmly, with the kind of moral authority that comes not from position, but from conviction. "My lord, these men have acted wickedly in all they have done to Jeremiah the prophet. They have thrown him into a cistern, where he will starve to death when there is no longer any bread in the city." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and they were an accusation. Direct, unambiguous. He called it what it was, wicked. He didn't say unfortunate. He did not say regrettable. He did not use diplomatic language or careful phrasing. He called it wickedness, and he pointed directly at the men responsible. The officials stared at him, their expression shifting from surprise to anger. Who was this foreign servant to call them wicked? Who was he to question their decisions? Who was he to speak to the king about matters of state? But Ebed-melech did not back down. He stood there, meeting the king's eyes, waiting for a response. There was a moment of tense silence. The king could have dismissed him, could have had him arrested for speaking out of turn, could have sided with the officials and rebuked this servant for his presumption. But something in Ebed-melech's words struck home. Perhaps it was the directness of the accusation. Perhaps it was the reminder that Jeremiah would starve to death, not die in battle, not be executed cleanly, but starve slowly in the dark. Perhaps it was simply that the king still felt guilty about his earlier cowardice, about telling the officials that he could do nothing to stop them. Whatever the reason, Zedekiah made a decision. "Take 30 men from here with you," the king said, his voice firm for once, "and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." 30 men. That was a significant number, more than necessary for a simple rescue. But the king understood the dynamics at play. He was giving Ebed-melech not just permission, but protection. 30 men meant that no one would interfere. It meant that the officials could not quietly stop the rescue. It meant that this was now a royal command, not a servant's request. The officials' expressions hardened, but they said nothing. The king had spoken, and while Zedekiah was weak in many ways, he was still the king. This was his palace, his God. For the moment at least, his word carried weight. Ebed-Melech bowed deeply, acknowledging the king's command. Then, without wasting a moment, he turned and left to gather the men. His heart was racing. He had done it. He had spoken truth to power, and somehow, miraculously, power had listened. But now came the hard part, the actual rescue. Chapter 5. The rescue Ebed-Melech moved quickly but deliberately. Time was critical. Jeremiah had already been in the cistern for at least a day, possibly longer. In the cold and the mud, without food or water, even a strong man would weaken rapidly. And Jeremiah was not a young man. He had endured years of persecution, imprisonment, beatings. His body had taken tremendous abuse. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to death. Ebed-Melech gathered the 30 men the king had assigned to him. They were soldiers from the king's guard, men accustomed to following orders. They did not question why they were being sent, to rescue a prophet whom most of the city considered a traitor. They simply followed. But before going to the cistern, Ebed-Melech made a stop that reveals something profound about his character. He went to the palace storeroom. He could have gone directly to the cistern. He had permission. He had the men. He had the authority of a royal command. Time was of the essence. The logical thing would be to rush to the courtyard, throw down some ropes, and pull Jeremiah out as quickly as possible. But Ebed-Melech did not do that. Instead, he went to the storeroom and began collecting items. Old rags, worn-out clothes, pieces of cloth that had been discarded, set aside, forgotten. The kind of materials that had no value, that no one wanted, that would normally be thrown away or used for the dirtiest of tasks. The soldiers watched, confused. What was he doing? Why was he wasting time collecting rags when a man was dying? But Ebed-Melech knew exactly what he was doing. He had thought about this carefully. He had imagined what it would be like to be in that cistern, standing in cold mud, weakened by hunger and thirst and exhaustion. He had thought about what it would be like to have ropes lowered down, to have your only chance of survival be to grip those ropes and be pulled up through 10 meters of darkness. And he had realized something that no one else had considered. The ropes would cut into Jeremiah's flesh. When you're being pulled upward by ropes tied around your arms, your entire body weight is suspended from those points of contact. If you are weak, if your skin is cold and fragile, if you have been standing in water and mud for hours, those ropes will tear into you like blades. They will cut through skin, damage muscle, possibly injure you so badly that even if you survive the rescue, you will carry the scars forever. Ebed-Melech could not prevent all of Jeremiah's suffering, but he could prevent this one unnecessary agony. So he gathered rags, soft, worn cloth, and he brought them, along with strong ropes, to the cistern. When they arrived at the courtyard of the guard, the cistern stood silent and ominous. Just a hole in the ground, really. But down in that darkness was a man who had spent his life trying to save his people, and who was now being killed for his efforts. Ebed-Melech approached the edge and called down, "Jeremiah!" His voice echoed against the stone walls. For a long moment there was no response. The soldiers exchanged glances. Were they too late? Then, faint and distant, a voice emerged from the depths. "I am here!" Relief flooded through Ebed-Melech. The prophet was still alive. But there was a weakness in that voice, a tremor that spoke of suffering and exhaustion. "Jeremiah, listen to me carefully," Ebed-Melech called down, his voice clear and calm despite the urgency he felt. "I am going to lower ropes to you. But first, I am lowering some old rags and worn-out clothes. When you receive them, I need you to put them under your armpits, between your arms and the ropes. Do you understand?" There was a pause. Then, "I understand." Ebed-Melech and the soldiers carefully lowered the bundle of rags into the cistern, playing out the rope slowly, making sure it reached the bottom. They waited, giving Jeremiah time to find the rags in the darkness, to understand what he needed to do. It took several minutes. They could hear faint sounds from below, movement, splashing, the soft grunts of a man trying to work with numb, trembling hands in complete darkness. Then Jeremiah's voice came again. stronger this time. "I am ready." Now they lowered the rescue ropes, thick and strong. Again they waited, patient, giving Jeremiah time to position the rags properly, to secure himself as best he could. "Pull," came the voice from below. Ebed-Melech organised the men, 30 soldiers, working in coordinated teams. They did not yank, they did not rush. They pulled steadily, smoothly, distributing the weight evenly, making sure the ascent was as gentle as possible. It was harder than they expected. Jeremiah was not a large man, but he was covered in thick mud that clung to him like weights, and the mud in the bottom of the cistern was deep. It released him reluctantly, sucking at his legs, trying to pull him back down. The soldiers strained. The ropes creaked. Slowly, inch by inch, Jeremiah rose through the darkness. It took time, much more time than a simple lift should take. But Ebed-Melech had insisted, slowly, carefully, no sudden movements. They could not risk the rope slipping or Jeremiah losing his grip. The circle of light at the top of the cistern must have seemed impossibly far away to Jeremiah as he spun slowly in the darkness, arms burning, body shaking with exhaustion. But that circle grew larger, closer, until finally his head emerged into the daylight. The soldiers reached down, gripping his arms, his shoulders, helping to lift him those final few feet. And then Jeremiah was out, lying on the ground beside the cistern, gasping for air, covered head to foot in black mud, trembling with cold and shock and relief. Ebed-Melech knelt beside him immediately. He did not recoil from the mud or the smell. He simply placed a hand on Jeremiah's shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity, of human connection. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You're safe." Jeremiah looked up at him, his eyes, the only part of his face not covered in mud, filled with tears. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. He tried to speak, but could not find words. Ebed-Melech understood. "Rest," he said. "Just rest." The soldiers stood around, some looking uncomfortable, others moved by what they had just witnessed. They had expected to simply follow orders, to perform a task. They had not expected this moment of raw humanity, of compassion cutting through the darkness of their circumstances. Ebed-Melech arranged for Jeremiah to be taken to a place where he could be cleaned, given water and food, allowed to recover. The prophet was returned to the courtyard of the guard, to confinement. The king's order had been to rescue him, not to free him. But at least he was alive. And as Ebed-Melech watched the prophet being led away, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of safety or security, not the peace of knowing his own troubles were over, but the peace that comes from doing what is right, regardless of cost. The peace that comes from acting in alignment with your deepest values, from being the kind of person you believe you should be. He had saved a life, and in doing so, perhaps he had saved something in himself as well. Chapter 6. Compassion in small details. There is something profound about the way Ebed-Melech conducted this rescue that deserves deeper reflection. He could have approached it differently. He had royal permission. He had 30 soldiers at his command. He had every right to simply throw down a rope and haul Jeremiah out as quickly as possible, treating the rescue as a logistical problem to be solved efficiently. No one would have questioned that approach. No one would have thought less of him for it. In fact, most people would have considered it perfectly appropriate. This was a time of war, a time of crisis. Speed and efficiency were paramount. Taking extra time to worry about comfort or dignity might have seemed like an unnecessary luxury. But Ebed-Melech saw it differently. He saw a man who had already suffered enormously, a man who had been betrayed by his own people, condemned by those he had tried to save, thrown into a pit and left to die in the most degrading way imaginable. And Ebed-Melech decided that this man deserved more than just survival. He deserved dignity. The rags were such a small thing. Worn-out cloth, worthless scraps. It would have taken only minutes to collect them. But those minutes mattered. Because when you have been treated as worthless, when you have been discarded and left to die, When you have been shown cruelty and indifference, the experience of someone treating you with care, with genuine, thoughtful care, is transformative. Jeremiah was not just pulled out of a cistern that day, he was pulled out with tenderness, with attention to his pain, with an understanding that rescue is not just about extracting a body from danger, but about restoring a person's humanity. This is what compassion looks like in its truest form. Compassion is not just feeling sorry for someone. It is not just wishing things were better. It is not just thinking kind thoughts or offering prayers from a distance. Compassion is active. It is practical. It is willing to get its hands dirty, to take extra time, to do things thoroughly rather than quickly. Compassion sees the person, not just the problem. Think about what Ebed-Melech could have done differently. He could have lowered ropes and shouted down, "Grab the ropes! We are pulling you up!" And Jeremiah would have grabbed them, because what choice did he have? And they would have pulled him up, and yes, the ropes would have cut into his flesh, and yes, it would have been agonizing, but he would have survived. Mission accomplished, right? But that approach treats Jeremiah as an object to be retrieved rather than a person to be cared for. It solves the immediate problem without considering the human being at the centre of that problem. Ebed-Melech refused to do that. He thought about what Jeremiah would experience. He imagined being in that cistern, cold and weak and terrified. He anticipated the pain that rough ropes would cause on fragile skin, and he took steps to prevent it. This is empathy translated into action, and the instructions he gave: put the rags under your armpits, between your arms and the ropes, show his attention to detail. He did not just throw down cloth and assume Jeremiah would figure it out. He explained exactly how to use the materials to maximize protection. He treated Jeremiah as someone worthy of clear communication, of patient guidance, of respect. Even the pace of the rescue reflects this compassion. They pulled slowly, steadily, no rushing, no jerking movements. They took their time, even though time was precious, because doing it right was more important than doing it quickly. There is a stark contrast here that is worth noting. The officials who threw Jeremiah into the cistern were cruel, but their cruelty was not exceptional. It was not dramatically different from the baseline cruelty that existed throughout the city. People were scared, desperate, cruel to each other in countless small ways. The officials just happened to be in a position where their cruelty had more dramatic consequences. Cruelty is often loud, obvious, easy to identify. We see it and we know it for what it is. We condemn it, or we should. But compassion, real compassion, is often quiet. It happens in small moments, in details that might go unnoticed. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It simply does what needs to be done, with care and attention and respect. Ebed-Melech could have rescued Jeremiah without compassion and still been considered a hero. He still would have saved a life. He still would have defied the officials. He still would have shown courage. But he went further. He rescued Jeremiah with compassion, and that additional element, that care for dignity, that attention to unnecessary suffering, that is what elevates this story from interesting to profound, because it reminds us that how we do things matters as much as what we do. It reminds us that there is a difference between solving a problem and caring for a person. It reminds us that even in the worst circumstances, even when time is short and resources are scarce and dangers are real, there is still room for gentleness. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the people who need help are not just problems to be solved. They are human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity, even, especially, when they are at their most vulnerable. Chapter 7. Judgment Falls on the City. The rescue of Jeremiah did not change the trajectory of Jerusalem's fate. The city was still under siege. The Babylonian armies were still camped outside the walls. The food supplies were still dwindling. The internal divisions were still tearing the city apart from within. Jeremiah's rescue was a small act of mercy in a world careening toward disaster. It saved one life. It restored one man's dignity. But it did not stop what was coming, and what was coming was judgment. The siege continued for months. At first, people believed they could endure it. They rationed food carefully. They collected every drop of water. They encouraged each other with stories of past victories, past deliverances, but weeks turned into months, and months turned into something darker. Hunger became famine. Famine became starvation. People began to die, not from violence, but simply from having nothing left to sustain them. The elderly died first, their bodies too weak to survive on minimal rations, then the sick, then the children, their small bodies unable to endure what the adults could barely withstand. The streets, once bustling with activity, grew quiet. People moved slowly, conserving energy, their faces hollow and gaunt. Mothers held their babies and wept dry tears, unable to produce milk, unable to comfort their starving children. Disease spread through the crowded city. When people are weakened by hunger, when sanitation breaks down, when hope is lost, illness follows. Plague moved from house to house, from street to street, leaving corpses in its wake. The soldiers on the walls grew thin and weak. They still stood guard, still watched the enemy armies in the distance, but they no longer spoke of victory. They simply endured day after day, waiting for the end. And then, one night, the end came. It happened during the 11th year of King Zedekiah's reign, in the 4th month. The Babylonian armies, which had been patient for so long, finally breached the walls. It was not a dramatic assault. There was no massive battle, no heroic last stand. The walls simply failed. Whether through siege engines finally succeeding, or through a weak point being exploited, or through betrayal from within, the text does not say. But the walls, which had stood for generations, which the people had trusted to protect them, finally gave way, and the Babylonian soldiers poured in. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The soldiers of Judah, weakened by months of starvation, could not mount effective resistance. The Babylonians swept through the streets systematically, killing any who resisted, capturing those who surrendered. The city descended into chaos. People ran in every direction, seeking safety that did not exist. Some hid in their homes, hoping the soldiers would pass by. Some fled toward the temple, believing that God's house would provide sanctuary. Some simply fell to their knees and waited for the end. The Babylonian commanders set up their headquarters in the middle gate, the symbolic centre of the city. From there they directed the conquest, the looting, the systematic destruction of everything Jerusalem had been. When King Zedekiah saw that the city had fallen, he did what weak men often do. He tried to run. He and his remaining soldiers attempted to escape under cover of darkness, fleeing through the king's garden, heading toward the Arabah, the desert wilderness where they hoped to disappear. But the Babylonian army was thorough. They had anticipated this possibility. Scouts had been watching every possible escape route. Zedekiah was captured in the plains of Jericho. His soldiers scattered. His escape failed. They brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, at Riblah in the land of Hamath. And there Nebuchadnezzar pronounced judgment. It was brutal, calculated, designed not just to punish, but to send a message. First, Zedekiah was forced to watch as his sons were executed. His children, his heirs, his future, killed before his eyes. The text does not describe what this did to him, but we can imagine. The helplessness, the horror, the knowledge that his weakness, his indecision, his inability to make hard choices had led to this moment. Then they put out his eyes. They blinded him, ensuring that the last thing he would ever see would be the death of his sons. For the rest of his life, that image would be burned into his memory, the final sight before darkness. Then they bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Babylon, where he would spend the remainder of his days in prison, blind and broken. A warning to others of what happened to puppet kings who tried to rebel against their masters. The officials who had led the rebellion, who had insisted on resistance, who had thrown Jeremiah into a cistern for telling them this would happen. They were executed, quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. Their names would be forgotten. Their plans had failed. Their defiance had accomplished nothing but death. The temple, which had stood for centuries, which the people had believed was inviolable because it was God's dwelling place, it was looted first, then burned. The priests tried to stop it, tried to reason with the soldiers, tried to explain that this was a holy place. They were cut down where they stood. The soldiers took the gold and silver vessels that had been used in worship, the treasures that had been accumulated over generations, and carried them away to Babylon. Then they set fires that consumed the wooden structures, that cracked the stone walls, that reduced the house of God to rubble and ash. The palace was burned. The houses of the officials were burned. These walls of Jerusalem, which had protected the city for so long, were systematically torn down. Stone by stone, block by block, the Babylonians demolished them, ensuring that Jerusalem would never again be a fortified city, never again be able to resist. And the people, those who had survived the siege, the disease, the conquest, were rounded up for exile. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, were marched out of the city in chains, beginning the long journey to Babylon. They would become servants, labourers, displaced persons in a foreign land, far from everything they had known. Everything Jeremiah had warned them about came to pass. Every prophecy he had spoken, every warning he had delivered, every unpopular truth he had proclaimed in the streets and courtyards, it all happened exactly as he had said it would. The city was destroyed. The people were exiled. The kingdom was ended. The judgment that had been promised for generations of disobedience finally fell, and it fell. Completely, but not everyone suffered the same fate. Eutychus chapter 8. God's promise to Ebed-Melech. Before the city fell, before the final chaos descended, God spoke to Jeremiah. It was not a public prophecy, not a message meant for the city or the officials or the king. This was private, personal, a message about one specific person. Go and tell Ebed-Melech the Cushite. It is remarkable that God knew his name, that God cared enough about this foreign servant, this man of no status or importance, to send a prophet with a specific message just for him. The message was this: "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. I am about to fulfill my words against this city, words concerning disaster, not prosperity. At that time they will be fulfilled before your eyes. But I will rescue you on that day, declares the Lord. You will not be given into the hands of those you fear. I will save you. You will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life, because you trust in me, declares the Lord." Read those words carefully. Let them sink in. God was about to destroy the city. Judgment was coming, inevitable and complete. But Ebed-Melech, this one man, this foreign servant, he would be spared. Not because he was perfect. Not because he had performed great miracles or prophesied the future or led armies. Not because he was Jewish or had the right bloodline or held an important position. But because he had trusted in God and acted with compassion. Because when everyone else had turned away from mercy, he had chosen it. Because when a life was in danger and no one else would help, he had stepped forward. God saw that. God remembered it. And God honoured it. The promise was specific. You will not be given into the hands of those you fear. Ebed-Melech feared the officials. He feared the consequences of defying them, of speaking against them, of rescuing the man they had condemned. That fear was rational, justified. Those men had power and were ruthless in using it. But God promised that those men would have no power over him. When the city fell, when the officials were captured and executed, Ebed-Melech would not share their fate. You will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life. This was not a promise of comfort or prosperity. God was not promising that Ebed-Melech would be wealthy or honoured or powerful. The promise was survival, life, the chance to continue existing in a world that was about to be torn apart. But survival, in those circumstances, was everything. And the reason, the explicit reason given in the text, was this: because you trust in me. Trust. Not perfect understanding, not flawless theology, not religious credentials or ritual purity, or any of the things that people often think God cares about most. Just trust. Trust that showed itself in action. Trust that manifested as compassion. Trust that was willing to risk safety for the sake of righteousness. When the city fell, when the Babylonian soldiers swept through Jerusalem, when officials were arrested and executed, when people were rounded up for exile, Ebed-Melech walked away unharmed. We do not know the details of how it happened. The text does not describe it. But somehow, in the chaos and violence, he was protected. Perhaps the soldiers overlooked him. Perhaps in the confusion of conquest, a foreign servant seemed too insignificant to bother with. Perhaps someone remembered his act of mercy and chose to repay it. Or perhaps God simply made sure he slipped through the cracks. However it happened, the promise was fulfilled. Ebed-Melech survived. He escaped with his life. The very thing God had promised came to pass, and he survived not despite his act of mercy, but because of it. Not in spite of his willingness to risk everything for righteousness, but because of it. In a city where everyone was trying to save themselves, where fear had made people cruel and selfish and willing to sacrifice others for their own safety, Ebed-Melech had chosen differently. And that choice, that single act of compassion, was remembered by God and rewarded with life. Chapter 9. What it means to be seen. There is something powerful about being truly seen, not just noticed, not just acknowledged, but truly seen, your actions, your choices, your heart. In a world where so much goes unnoticed, where so many acts of kindness pass without recognition, where people do good things and no one ever knows, there is something deeply meaningful about the idea that God sees. Ebed-Melech did not rescue Jeremiah for recognition. There was no reward waiting for him, no promotion, no public honour. In fact, he risked everything with no guarantee of any positive outcome at all. He did it because it was right, because a man was dying and he could not bear to let it happen, because his conscience would not allow him to look away, and God saw it. In a city of thousands of people, in a crisis that involved kings and officials and priests and prophets, God noticed what one foreign servant did, and God thought it mattered enough to send a specific personal message of protection. This tells us something important about how God values actions. It is not the grand gestures that matter most. It is not the public displays or the impressive achievements or the things that make it into history books. It is the quiet acts of mercy, the moments when someone chooses compassion over fear, the times when a person sees suffering and responds with care, even when no one is watching, even when there is no reward, even when it costs something. Those are the moments God sees. Those are the moments God remembers. Those are the moments that matter eternally. Ebed-Melech was a servant, a eunuch, a foreigner. In the social hierarchy of ancient Jerusalem, he was near the bottom. He had no power, no influence, no status. And yet, in this story, he is the hero. Not the king, who was weak and indecisive. Not the officials, who were cruel and self-serving. Not the priests, who failed to protect a prophet. Not even Jeremiah himself, though Jeremiah is certainly righteous and faithful. The hero is the servant who noticed suffering and chose to act. This should challenge our assumptions about importance and significance. We tend to think that the people who matter are the ones with titles, with authority, with public platforms. We look to leaders and celebrities and influencers to show us what matters. But this story suggests something different. It suggests that the most important people in any society might be the ones we never hear about, the ones who quietly do what is right, the ones who show mercy when others show cruelty, the ones who risk everything for someone else's life. Ebed-Melech's act of compassion rippled through history in ways he could never have anticipated. He saved Jeremiah's life, and because Jeremiah lived, he continued to prophesy, and because he continued to prophesy, his words were recorded, and because his words were recorded, they became part of Scripture, and because they became part of Scripture, they have influenced billions of people for thousands of years, all because one man chose mercy over fear. This is how change actually happens in the world, not through grand schemes or dramatic interventions from above, but through individual choices made by ordinary people in moments when it would be easier to look away. Every act of compassion creates ripples. We cannot always see them. We cannot always trace the connections, but they are real. When you choose to help someone in need, you do not know what future that person might have. You do not know what they might accomplish, who they might influence, what difference they might make. You're simply choosing, in that moment, to value their life, their dignity, their humanity, and that choice matters more than we can measure. Chapter 10. The test of character. There is a concept in ethics called the test of conscience. The idea that the true measure of a person's character is revealed in moments when they must choose between what is easy and what is right, especially when no one is watching. Ebed-Melech faced exactly this kind of test. He could have rationalized inaction. It would have been easy to do so. He could have told himself that Jeremiah had brought this on himself with his controversial prophecies, that the officials knew best, that a foreign servant had no right to interfere in matters of state, that speaking up would only bring trouble without actually helping. These would all have been socially acceptable reasons for staying silent. No one would have blamed him for them, but he did not take the easy path. He took the hard one. And this is where character is truly forged, in the space between knowing what is right and actually doing it. Many people know what is right. They can articulate moral principles. They can identify injustice when they see it. They can feel the pull of conscience, but knowing is not the same as doing. The gap between knowledge and action is where character lives. Ebed-Melech could have known it was wrong to leave Jeremiah in the cistern and still done nothing. Knowledge alone does not require action, but character does. Character is what makes you act on your convictions even when it is costly, even when it is dangerous, even when you gain nothing and risk everything. And Ebed-Melech had that kind of character. This raises an important question. Where does that kind of character come from? The text gives us a clue in God's promise. Because you trust in me. Trust in God. Faith. Not just intellectual belief, but a deep conviction that shaped how Ebed-Melech saw the world and his place in it. If you believe that every human being is made in the image of God, then you cannot dismiss their suffering as irrelevant. If you believe that God sees all actions, then you cannot assume that quiet mercy goes unnoticed. If you believe that righteousness matters more than safety, then you must act accordingly, even when it is hard. Ebed-Melech's faith was not abstract theology. It was lived reality. It shaped his choices in concrete, practical ways. This is what authentic faith looks like. Not just attending religious services or reciting prayers or following rituals. Those things may be part of faith, but they are not the essence of it. The essence of faith is trust that transforms action, belief that changes behaviour, conviction that manifests as compassion. Ebed-Melech trusted that doing right mattered more than staying safe. He trusted that God cared about mercy. He trusted that one person's actions could make a difference, even if that person was a foreign servant with no power or status. And that trust made him brave. Chapter 11. The courage to stand alone. One of the most difficult aspects of Ebed-Melech's choice was that he stood alone. He was not part of a movement. There was no group of people rallying to Jeremiah's defense. There was no public outcry against the injustice. There was no one to stand beside him and share the risk. He was alone in his conviction that this was wrong and something needed to be done. Standing alone requires a different kind of courage than standing with others. When you are part of a group, there is safety in numbers, there is mutual support, there is the comfort of knowing that if you fall, others will catch you. But when you stand alone, you bear the full weight of consequence yourself. Ebed-Melech could not look to others for validation. He could not wait for someone else to act first. He could not hide in the crowd. He had to make the choice by himself, accept the risk by himself, face the potential consequences by himself. This is one of the most challenging tests a person can face, doing what is right when no one else will. History is filled with stories of lone individuals who stood against injustice when everyone else stayed silent, who spoke truth when everyone else went along with lies, who showed mercy when everyone else showed cruelty. These stories inspire us because we recognize how difficult it is, how much courage it requires, how much easier it would be to simply conform, to go along with the crowd, to tell ourselves that if everyone else is doing it, it must be acceptable. But Ebed-Melech did not need others to validate his conviction. He knew what was right, and that knowledge was enough. This is a crucial lesson for us, because there will be times in our lives when we see something wrong, and we look around and no one else seems to care. No one else is speaking up, no one else is taking action. In those moments, it is easy to doubt ourselves, to think, maybe I am overreacting, maybe it is not as bad as I think, maybe I am missing something that everyone else understands. But sometimes the crowd is wrong. Sometimes silence is complicity. Sometimes waiting for others to act first means that no one ever acts at all. Ebed-Melech teaches us that one person can make a difference, not because they are special or powerful or uniquely qualified, but simply because they choose to act when action is needed. Chapter 12. The power of individual choice. We live in a world that often feels overwhelming. The problems are so large, the systems so entrenched, the suffering so widespread. It is easy to feel powerless, to believe that individual actions do not matter in the face of such massive challenges. But this story contradicts that belief. Ebed-Melech was one person. He had no political power, no social influence, no resources beyond what he could gather from a storeroom. He was as powerless as a person could be in that society. And yet, his choice to act saved a life. More than that, it saved the prophecies that would become part of Scripture. It preserved words that would influence the course of human history. One person's choice rippled through time in ways he could never have imagined. This is the power of individual choice. We may not be able to solve every problem or fix every injustice. We may not be able to change entire systems with a single action. But we can change individual circumstances. We can help individual people. We can make choices that honour human dignity and value human life. And those choices matter. They matter to the people we help. They matter in the eyes of God, and they matter in ways we cannot always see or measure. Every time someone chooses compassion over indifference, they change the world a little. Every time someone risks safety for righteousness, they push back against the darkness. Every time someone stands up for what is right, they make it easier for the next person to do the same. Ebed-Melech did not overthrow the system that condemned Jeremiah. He did not change the politics of Jerusalem. He did not stop the siege or prevent the fall of the city. But he saved one man. He showed one act of mercy. He made one choice that honoured life over death, compassion over cruelty, courage over fear. And that was enough. It was enough to be remembered by God. It was enough to change the course of events. It was enough to become a story that would be told for thousands of years. It was enough. Epilogue. The faith that saves. Quietly. The story of Ebed-Melech is not one of the famous stories from the Bible. It does not appear in children's picture books. It is not preached from pulpits every Sunday. It does not have the dramatic flair of David and Goliath, or the epic scope of Moses and the Exodus. Most people have never heard his name, and yet his story is there, preserved in the book of Jeremiah, recorded for all time. Why? Because it reminds us of something we too easily forget. Faith is not always loud. Courage is not always seen. The acts that matter most are not always the ones that make the headlines or win the applause of crowds. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is notice when someone else is suffering, to care when everyone else has moved on, to speak when speaking is dangerous, to act when acting costs something. Ebed-Melech had every reason to stay silent. He was a foreigner, a servant, a man with no power, no protection, no guarantee of safety. Helping Jeremiah gained him nothing. It risked everything. But he did it anyway. He did not wait for someone else to act. He did not assume that because he was unimportant, his actions would not matter. He simply saw what was wrong and chose to do what was right. And that choice saved a life. Not just any life, but the life of a prophet whose words would echo through history. A man whose message would be recorded in Scripture and read by millions. A man whose courage in the face of death would inspire generations. Jeremiah survived because one person refused to look away, and in the end, When the city fell and judgment came, God did not forget the man who had shown mercy. Ebed-Melech was spared. He escaped with his life. He walked out of the ruins of Jerusalem and into a future that most of his generation would never see, because he had trusted in God, not with grand declarations, not with public displays of piety, but with a quiet, deliberate act of compassion when no one else would. This is the kind of faith that saves, the kind that does not wait for permission or recognition, the kind that acts because it is right, not because it is easy, the kind that sees people not as problems or threats, but as human beings made in the image of God, worthy of dignity and care. History remembers kings and prophets, but God remembers people like Ebed-Melech, and sometimes that is the most important kind of remembering there is. Closing reflection. What we can learn. As we close this story, it is worth reflecting on what it means for us today. We may never face the exact circumstances that Ebed-Melech faced. We may never have to decide whether to rescue a prophet from a cistern or approach a king to plead for someone's life. But we will face moments when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. When we must decide whether to speak up or stay silent. When we must determine whether someone else's suffering matters enough to us to do something about it. In those moments, Ebed-Melech's example speaks to us. It tells us that one person can make a difference, that powerlessness is not an excuse for inaction, that compassion is not just a feeling, but a choice that manifests in practical, concrete actions. It tells us that how we treat the vulnerable reveals who we truly are, that mercy is more valuable than safety, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. It tells us that God sees quiet acts of kindness, that our actions matter even when no one else notices, that faith is measured not by our words but by our willingness to risk something for someone else. We live in a world that still needs people like Ebed-Melech, people who notice suffering and cannot look away, people who speak up when others stay silent, people who choose mercy over fear. The question is, will we be those people? When we see injustice, will we act or will we find reasons why it is not our problem? When we encounter suffering, will we respond with compassion or will we protect our own comfort? When doing the right thing requires courage, will we step forward or will we step back? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the questions that define our lives, our character, our legacy. Ebed-Melech was not a perfect person. He was not a superhero. He was an ordinary man who faced an impossible choice and chose mercy. That same choice is available to us, not once in a lifetime, but repeatedly, in small moments and large ones, in public and in private, in ways that will be remembered and in ways that will be forgotten. But whether remembered or forgotten by people, God sees. God knows. God honours those who choose righteousness over safety, who value mercy over comfort, who act with compassion when it would be easier to look away. This is the legacy of Ebed-Melech, not a legacy of fame or power or achievement, but a legacy of quiet faithfulness, of compassion in action, of courage when it mattered most. May we have the wisdom to see suffering when others look away. May we have the courage to speak up when others stay silent. May we have the compassion to act when others do nothing. And may we trust, as Ebed-Melech did, that choosing what is right is always worth it, even when it costs us everything.